I would normally say happy Friday the 13th, but such an unlucky day combined with the worst year in my lifetime, not really a good combination. So let's just wrap this series up and get into the final Friday the 13th review. Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel. This is my review for Friday the 13th, as in the 2009 remake or reboot. I think reboot might be a more appropriate term for this movie because it's not a straight up remake of the original Friday the 13th. What this movie does is pretty much take elements of the first 3, maybe 4 Friday the 13th movies, and then just put them all into one movie, because you have Mrs. Voorhees at the beginning of the movie during the credits being beheaded. Then you have Jason in the first half of the movie wearing a potato sack, like in part 2. Then later on he gets the hockey mask, like in part 3 and the rest of the series. And one of the main driving forces of this movie is a sibling relationship between brother and sister, just like in the final chapter. And the main plot is just as you would expect from any typical Friday the 13th movie. A bunch of dumbass college students go out to the middle of the woods, smoke pot, get drunk, have sex, and they get butchered by Jason Voorhees. The only difference this time around is that you have one character who's not in this initial group, named Clay, who's going to Crystal Lake trying to find his sister, who was actually featured in the opening sequence of the film and has gone missing for a full month. So this was actually the second Friday the 13th movie I've ever seen in my lifetime, the first being the original. And it's really weird looking back at this era of horror movies when you compare it to the era that we're in right now. I know we aren't rid of horror remakes, and in fact, the best horror movie of the year is a remake in itself. But back then, everything was a straight-up remake. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which started the whole thing. You had Black Christmas. You'd have Rob Zombie's Halloween. And then in this case, you have Friday the 13th, which is actually one of the remakes that has gotten more appreciation from that era of horror. Because when you think about it, the Friday the 13th series just got super ridiculous and super over the top. I mean, the last 4 movies prior to this remake was Jason Takes Manhattan, where Jason barely appeared in New York City. Jason Goes to Hell, where he became some sort of demon worm. Jason X, where he went to outer space. And then Freddy vs. Jason, where he fought Freddy Krueger. And one of the things that I wish I could do with a time machine is go back to 1980 after the first Friday the 13th came out and tell audience members, hey, guess what? The series is going to go on for 11 more movies after this. It's actually going to follow Jason Voorhees as an adult, and by the time you get to the 10th movie, he's going to be in outer space, and by the time you get to the 11th movie, he's going to be fighting another horror icon that hasn't been invented yet and won't appear until 1984, named Freddy Krueger. And if I told people that in 1980, they would have looked at me like I was insane. So in that sense, I get the decision to reboot Friday the 13th and get Jason back to his roots, because it just got really ridiculous. Even though I have said on a number of occasions that some of the more enjoyable Friday the 13th movies are the movies that are aware of the type of movie they are, just goofy, and they embrace the goofiness. The reboot, however, is an exception because it's not in continuity with the previous films, as if the previous films gave a damn about continuity. Anyway, it has the opportunity to be scary again. It has the opportunity to reinvent Jason Voorhees for a more modern audience. And even though Freddy vs. Jason had just come out 6 years prior to this movie, that movie was pretty ridiculous in its own right, but I'll save my full opinions for next year. And the result is a classic Friday the 13th movie in every angle, for better and most certainly for worse. The one element that I really like about this Friday the 13th is the fact that it tries to be scary again, and this time it succeeds. You don't get any scenes in this movie that are supposed to be played for horror but come across as silly or ridiculous. No, everything in this movie is played for horror, and most of the time it's pretty effective. It has a more polished look since it has more money to work with. It has a more tense atmosphere. It's grisly, and it doesn't look at all cheap like the previous films. It has a decently sized budget for a slasher movie, and they make the most of it. Jason Voorhees himself is actually pretty terrifying this time around. He's played by Derek Mears, who would later on play the original Predator in Predators, and he would also play Kick Puncher in Community. Don't call me Kick Puncher. Call me David. But yeah, that's how I recognize Derek Mears, as Kick Puncher from Community. But as Jason Voorhees, he's pretty intense. Kane Hodder will still be my favorite Jason because he's just so iconic and he's played that role more than once. But Derek Mears makes for a good Jason Voorhees because he is more aggressive. This Jason Voorhees is not a lumbering zombie this time around. He's back to being a disfigured hillbilly. And rather than killing his victims as quick as possible, he tortures his victims and puts them in scenarios where they are in such pain. And the kills in this movie are actually pretty brutal in terms of gore and just in terms of the creativity. And when I say creative, I don't mean over-the-top goofy creative, like the Sub-Zero kill in Jason X, or the douchebag sandwich kill in Freddy vs. Jason, which that's what I'm gonna call that kill. What I mean by inventive is just more in a brutal manner, like tying up a girl in a sleeping bag over a fire, letting her cook, setting up bear traps to catch his victims, taking his time to kill people so he can try to drag their friends out. This Jason is brutal, he's efficient, he's somewhat sympathetic, but then again, that's always been Jason Voorhees if you really want to see this character in a sympathetic light, which I don't personally. But he's just a scary Jason. This is the first time in any of the movies where Jason Voorhees, to me, has legitimately been scary, and I think it's pretty effective. Although there is one element in this movie that I do find pretty funny, not in an unintentional manner, but apparently Jason Voorhees grows weed in Crystal Lake because the opening sequence of the movie has a bunch of college students trying to find this patch of weed in the forest, and Jason kills them for trying to find the weed, and then some redneck stumbles across this weed and then later gets killed by Jason Voorhees. So you have to wonder, is Jason Voorhees actually killing these people as revenge for the death of his mother, or is he just trying to protect his weed stash, which he doesn't seem smart enough to just sell, but whatever. So those are all the elements of the movie that I think makes it shine. Everything else is just as bland or generic as the rest of the movies. More specifically, the characters. The main character of this movie, Clay, is probably the most sympathetic because he's not going out to the middle of the woods to drink, smoke, or have sex. He's going out there to try to find his sister, and even though Clay and his sister don't have that much screen time together, you do buy into the relationship, and it's a good motivation and gives you at least one character to care about, maybe two. You have Travis Van Winkle, who plays this ultimate jock douchebag, and he had a brief role in Michael Bay's Transformers playing the bully, and Michael Bay did produce this movie, but his character is just so obnoxious and such an asshole that you would be shocked if he didn't get the best death in the movie. And he does. It's nothing super inventive like in the previous films, but in terms of the most brutal or the most humiliating death, Jason saved that for him. The only other sympathetic character, and I say that just in the sense that she's not unlikable, is the girlfriend to Travis Van Winkle's character, because she actually tries to help Clay find his sister. And I think one of the most shocking elements of the movie is that they build her up to be a final girl, but Jason kills her near the end of the movie, and that took me by surprise, because even before I got into horror movies, I was always familiar with the final girl trope, and for this character to be built up as a final girl, only to get killed off, was quite surprising and shocking. Another thing that's really to be expected with this movie is the gratuitous nudity. Again, it's not quite as gratuitous, in my opinion, as A New Beginning, but it makes up for the fact that this movie has probably the most explicit sex scene of any mainstream movie that I've seen, and definitely the most explicit sex scene in the Friday the 13th series. And the problem with it is that it goes on forever. Like, it cuts away to something else happening in the movie, and then it'll cut back to the sex scene, and I'm like, man, it's still going on? And again, it's just so gratuitous, and it's almost downright pornographic. I've only seen the unrated version of this movie, but I have to wonder if the sex scene went on as long in the theatrical version. I couldn't imagine that the MPAA would let them have this long a sex scene and this explicit of one in theaters, but well, that's just my opinion. And then the last problem I had with this movie that I'm not going to go into too much detail about is the film's ending. I won't say what happens, but it is just so predictable and lazy that anybody with a brain could see it coming a mile away, especially if you've seen a Friday the 13th movie, or you've marathoned them all in prep for a series of reviews like I did. So to wrap things up, I think the remake is a mixed bag. I think it's one of the better Friday the 13th movies, and is the only exception to the better movies embrace the series for its goofiness, because it does attempt to be scary. It works at being effectively scary. Derek Mears makes for a great Jason, but everything else about the movie is just so boring, cliched, and predictable that you really wish they could have done something more with this remake. So I would say watch at your own risk. If you're hesitant about watching any of the Friday the 13th movies and you think they look really cheesy, then this remake here, or reboot, is a good way to just kind of watch the first 3 movies, or 4 movies, condensed into one with a more serious tone. I think it's effective in that manner, but honestly, I would rather watch Jason Lives, Freddy vs. Jason, or Jason X above the reboot. And I've heard a lot of people say that the reboot is the best Friday the 13th movie, and I don't agree with that at all. I still think Jason Lives is the superior movie. But even then, with me not agreeing that this is the best Friday the 13th movie, it's not as bad as some of the other remakes that were coming out at the time. And I gotta say one thing that was crossing through my mind when watching this movie again. It is so interesting how the horror genre has evolved since the era of remakes, because thanks to people like Jason Blum, Jordan Peele, James Wan, and Leigh Whannell, we're now in a true golden age of horror, and the genre is getting a lot more respect, and we have a lot more original horror movies coming out, as opposed to everything being a remake like it was in the 2000s. Again, I know there's still a handful of remakes out there, like The Invisible Man just this year, but at least you get more original horror movies than you do remakes. So rewatching the 2009 Friday the 13th is really a weird time capsule compared to now. And there you go, that's my review for the 2009 reboot of Friday the 13th, and this concludes my series of Friday the 13th reviews. Like I said before, I will be reviewing Freddy vs. Jason next year once I do all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but I really want to know what the future of the Friday the 13th series has in store. Because it's been 11 years since the reboot has come out. We've had the Friday the 13th video game, which just had its last update a couple days ago, and Jason Blum has actually expressed interest in doing another Friday the 13th, which, hey, since Jason Blum is one of the main people responsible for this golden age of horror, I'd be on board with that. Especially considering the fact that the next movie would literally be the 13th Friday the 13th movie. But also, there are a lot of elements from all the previous films that really couldn't be done this day and age, or at least would be frowned upon. So if another Friday the 13th movie ends up being made, I'm really curious to see what they do with it, especially in this new age of horror. So when will that happen? Who knows, but if it ever does happen, I'm looking forward to it. So now with all that said and done, I want to know what you guys think about the reboot of Friday the 13th. If you've seen it, what did you think? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until then, this is the Real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one